welcome back to my channel Total Age, a guide to learner. Here, this is Sriparna. Hope all of you are doing well. So, in my last session for the statistics of economics, we have learned that one single value, which is called a measure of central tendency, and which can be derived from the data to represent the whole data. But today we are going to discuss another new chapter, that is measures of dispersion, and in this chapter we will find some other measures to supplement and straighten the representative nature of the measure of central tendency. So these other type of measures are called measures of dispersion. So learner, if you have missed my previous session, so please go and check my description box and my first comment where the previous session for the statistics of economics is sessions link is already shared. So move on the next slide. So learner, if you have missed my previous session, so please go and check my description box and my first comment where the previous session link is already shared. So now move on the next slide. So here we can see some subtopics, so basically which we will study today. So the one of the most and important subtopic of this chapter and basic concept of this chapter, that is the definition of dispersion. And now going to the second topic, that is objectives of dispersion, and move on the third one, that is characteristics of a good measure of dispersion, and fourth one is various measures of dispersion, and there are two type various measures of dispersion. First one is absolute measures and relative measures, and now going to the last one, this is the range, and range is the one of the sub part of the absolute measures of dispersion. So let's start the session and move on the main slide. So here this is a slide for definition of measures of dispersion. So we have already told the measures of dispersion is basically the other types of measures to supplement and straighten the representative nature of the measures of central tendency, and these other measures are called measures of dispersion. So basically the measures of dispersion, so the word that is dispersion is basically the degree of variation. So this is the basic meaning, degree of variation. Clear? In the data, obviously. So it relates to the spread or variation of the data. The extent to which the numerical data in any distribution differ among themselves is a measure of dispersion. According to the Spiegel, the degree to which numerical data tend to spread out on an average value is called variation or dispersion of data. So basically it is the degree of variation. Okay, so I think what do you mean by measure of dispersion is clear to everyone. So now move on the next slide. So here we can see some objectives of the measures of dispersion. So first one is measures of dispersion helps to measure the reliability of the measure of the central tendency. So it is useful in finding out whether an average is a true presentation of the series or not. So basically it helps to measure the reliability of the measure of central tendency. So measure of dispersion is basically related to the measures of central tendency. Okay, so measure of dispersion helps to measure the reliability of the measure of central tendency. So both are related to each other. Okay, I think this is clear. So now move on the second point. So when the data is dispersed or spread out, so then show some characteristics of the given data. Okay, so these characteristics of variation in the data also need to be understood. It supplements the knowledge about the average in knowing more facts about the characteristics of the given data. Now move on the third one. Okay, so measures of dispersion basically may be helpful in analyzing why large variations occur. Okay, so these may be helpful in controlling the variation or the spread out of the data itself. So now move on the third one. Measures of dispersion are useful in the study of other statistical technique like correlation, regression, etc. So measures of dispersion is related to the measures of central tendency, and measures of dispersion is also related to the is also useful in the study of other statistical techniques, that is correlation, regression, etc. And for a comparison of the data from different samples, whether from different places or different time periods, a comparison on the basis of the averages or measures of central tendency is not enough. So the dispersion also needs to be compared. So a greater degree of dispersion, a large degree of dispersion would mean the lack of uniformity of homogeneity of the data. So the main thing, a high degree of variation is called where represents the lack of uniformity of homogeneity of the data, and and low degree of variation indicates the two series are uniform or homogeneous. Okay, so high degree of variation indicates there is no uniformity and homogeneity of data, and low degree of dispersion indicates the data are uniform or and homogeneous. Clear? So this is the basic objectives of the measuring dispersion. So basically measures of dispersion helps to measure the reliability of the measures of central tendency when the data is spread out, when the data is dispersed. They show some characteristics of the given data which is very obvious. Third one is it may be helpful in analyzing why large variations occur, and last but not the least, it helps in the study of the statistical techniques like correlation coefficient, regression analysis, etc. So low degree of variation, so we have already told dispersion basically indicates a degree of variation. So when high degree of variation, so which means there is no uniformity and homogeneity in the data, but in the low degree of variation indicates two series or two data are uniform and homogeneous. I think objectives of dispersion is clear to everyone. So now move on the next concept, that is characteristics. Okay, so the first characteristic of the measures of dispersion which is rigidly defined. So a good measure of dispersion should have the would have that characteristics. Okay, so it should be precisely and clearly defined. So it should be rigidly defined. So the second one is it is easy to understand and calculate. Okay, so measures of dispersion should be easily understood as a measure of variability in the data. Okay, so when we are using measures of dispersion, so where the data have large variation. Okay, so the that the situation we are using the measure of dispersion, and it is easy to understand and it is easy to calculate. Okay, and it should be precisely and clearly defined. And now move on the third characteristics, that is based on all items. So measures of dispersion should be based on all the observation of the data. A measure which is not based on all the data may not be a good measure, because some characteristics of the data may not be reflected in that measure. So that's why it is one of the important characteristics of measures of dispersion. It is based on all the items. Okay, it is based on all the observation of the data. So now move on the fourth one. It is unaffected by the extreme values. So obviously it we have already told it is based on the all observation of the data, so that's why it should be unduly affected by the presence of extreme values. Now move on the fifth one, which is sampling stability. So it should not vary widely when samples are taken from the same population. It should be less affected by differences in samples from the same population. So it should not be vary widely when samples are taken from the same population. Clear? And it should be less affected by differences in samples from the same population. So that's why we called measures of dispersion has the sampling stability. Okay, so because it should be less affected by the differences of the data, so it has the power of the stability. So it has the sampling stability, and which is one of the most important characteristics of measures of dispersion. And now move on the last one, algebraic treatment. So we have already told it is easy to calculate. It should be easy. It should be calculate. So now move on the sixth one or last one. This is the algebraic treatment. Okay, so it should be capable of being treated algebraically. So it means that if the measures of dispersion of separate parts of the same set of data are available, the measures should be such that they can give a measure of dispersion for the whole set of data. So algebraic treatment, so it should be capable of being treated algebraically. So which is also one of the most important characteristics of the measures of dispersion. And we have already told the measure should be easy to calculate, and which is also the most important characteristic. So I think characteristics of good measure of dispersion is clear to everyone. So now move on the next topic, and this is measures of dispersion, types of measures of dispersion. So there are two measures of dispersion. So first one is absolute and second one is relative. So at first we have to know what do you mean by a absolute measure. So when dispersion of the series is expressed in terms of the original units, okay, original units of series, it is called the absolute measure, okay. So when the dispersion of the series is expressed in terms of the original units, which is known as absolute measure. Clear? For example, absolute measures are expressed in units in which the original date. So I think characteristics of good measure of dispersion is clear to everyone. So now move on the next slide. So here we can see the another slide for measures of dispersion. Okay. Uh, so dispersion or variability of the data is calculated with the help of a number of measures. So there are two measures of dispersion. First one is absolute measure and second one is the relative measures. So at first we have to know what do you mean by a absolute measure. So when dispersion of the series is expressed in the terms of the original units, okay, original units of the series, it is called the absolute measure of dispersion. So basically absolute measures are expressed in units in which the original data is expressed. For example, if the data relates to the height in meters and centimeters, so these measures of dispersion are also in the same unit, so which is known as absolute measure. So basically it is basically absolute measures is expressed in terms of the original units of the series. Clear? So now move on the second measure of dispersion, that is relative measures of dispersion. So what do you mean by a relative dispersion, learner? Uh, so basically, in cases where the different data is measured in different units, the comparison of the dispersion becomes difficult. So there are two sets of data. For example, relating to the age of 50 persons and their heights may give us different averages. So variability measures in years in the case of age and meters and centimeters in the case of height. So comparison of the variability in age in years with height in meters and centimeters will be meaningless. So in order to overcome that type of problem of lack of comparability of the absolute measures of dispersion are replaced by the second type measures of dispersion. This is relative measures. Okay, so these relative measures of dispersion are measured as ratios or percentage relative to the average. So they are independent of the units in which data are expressed. So they are known as coefficients. So relative measures basically helps to overcome the problem of lack of comparability absolute measures of dispersion. Okay, so when there are different types of data and when there are different types of data are measured in a different units, so the comparison of the dispersion becomes difficult because there are two different units. So for avoiding this type of problem, we use the relative measures of dispersion. I think this is clear. So learner, there are four measure of dispersion. So range, quartile deviation, mean deviation and standard deviations all are under the absolute measures. Basically absolute measures of dispersion are expressed in terms of the original units of the series. Okay, So range, quartile deviation, mean deviation, standard deviation is under the absolute measure. And now going to the next slide where we can see what are the measure of dispersion under the relative measure. So coefficient of range, coefficients of quartile deviation, coefficient of mean deviation, coefficient of standard deviations, all are included in the relative measures of dispersion. Clear? So we will study about the all types of coefficient, that is range, quartile deviation, mean deviation and standard deviation. So I think this is clear. So now move on the first measure of dispersion of the absolute according to the absolute measures, which is range. Okay, so here this is the slide for range. So range is basically one of the most simple and commonly understandable measure of dispersion, and it is defined as the difference between the highest and lowest observed value in the series. So basically it indicates the difference between the highest value and the lowest value in the series of data. Clear? So the formula of range, so that is highest value minus lowest value. So that's why we called this is the one of the most simple and commonly understandable measures of dispersion. So I think this is clear. What do you mean by a range and what is the basic formula of the range? So learner, we are done for the today's session. So in this session we have discussed the definition of measures of dispersion, its objectives, characteristics of the good measure of dispersion, and most importantly the range. So range is one of the most important absolute measures of dispersion. So I think it will be very helpful to everyone. So I will come again with an exciting session. So till then stay tuned. But if you like my session, so please do not forget to like, share and comment, and please do some support and subscribe to my channel, and you can press the bell button for getting new notifications from my side. Happy learning. Thank you.